Hi, the SI meteorologist Paul Dorian here. Well, we're now approaching the middle part of September. It's been several weeks since we've talked about the solar conditions in terms of the number of sunspots. We are in the midst of solar cycle number 24, which is supposed to be ramping up to a solar maximum somewhere in the middle or latter part of next year, 2013. But quite frankly, the sun has been rather quiet over the last several weeks, and this is despite the fact that we are approaching what appears to be the solar maximum for this particular solar cycle. Here's the very latest solar image. A couple of sunspots here, nothing too noteworthy, however. Here's one over here, and then if you look on the far left, there's another one perhaps rotating into more directly facing the Earth over the next few days. But all in all, rather quiet. It's been rather quiet for the last several weeks, and this is kind of indicative of what's been going on with solar cycle 24. Basically, it's been underwhelming as it continues towards a solar maximum next year. And as we get deeper and deeper into this particular solar cycle, it becomes more and more predictable in terms of how this will rank in terms of sunspot strength, number of sunspots compared to a lot of the previous solar cycles. And we'll talk about that over the next few minutes. Well, here's the very latest plot from NASA of the sunspot numbers for this particular solar cycle. And again, here we are right here, September of 2012, what appears to be headed towards a solar maximum somewhere in the middle or latter part of 2013. And the bottom line is, this is definitely a weaker cycle compared to the last one, which you can see right here, peaked back around the year 2000. And that was a weaker cycle than the prior one, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So this is continuing a trend of weaker and weaker sunspot cycles in terms of the number of sunspots. And this has really been the situation for the last couple of decades. And there are already predictions that the next solar cycle, number 25, will be weaker than this particular one sometime next decade in the 2020s. Well, here's a plot of the monthly average sunspot numbers for solar cycles dating all the way back to the middle part of the 1700s. In fact, that's when we started numbering solar cycles. This is number 24 right now, and here it is right here. As you can see, it is continuing, it's seemingly continuing a trend of weaker and weaker cycles in this fashion right here. And again, there are some predictions that the next solar cycle will be even weaker than this one sometime next decade in the 2020s. And as we get deeper and deeper into the solar cycle, it becomes kind of more and more accurate to predict where this will fall relative to prior solar cycles. And it now appears as if this may very well turn out to be the weakest solar cycle in terms of number of sunspots since way back more than 100 years ago, this particular solar cycle, I believe number 14, that peaked somewhere around 1906. So this is kind of a historic occurrence that's going on the sun. It continues a trend of weaker and weaker cycles. In this particular solar cycle, number 24, that should peak next year, looks like it'll be one of the weakest in more than 100 years. Now let me add, the fact that it is a weak, underwhelming cycle does not mean there cannot be some massive solar storms. It just generally means that there will be fewer solar storms and less active in general, but any one of those particular large sunspots can cause a serious solar storm. So obviously things have to be monitored over the next several months as we approach the solar maximum. Now, if you go way back, and this is a particular plot that goes really 400 years of sunspot observations, it's kind of interesting that there were several decade periods way back a few hundred years ago that had several weak solar cycles in a row. One such period, called the Dalton minimum, occurred here in the latter part of the 1700s into the early part of the 1800s, and there's speculation that there was an even deeper minimum back in the 1600s called the Maunder minimum. Both of these periods had several decades of weak solar cycles, and that led to globally cooling temperatures, negative temperatures, and the little ice age, for example. Nobody is necessarily predicting that right now, but it's interesting that we are in a weaker and weaker state here in the last couple of solar cycles, and we'll see if that continues for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years or so. Now, we've talked about this before. At the same time, the sun seems to be going through a phase of weaker and weaker solar cycles. we also have a kind of a flip in the northern Pacific Ocean in terms of temperatures. We've seemingly entered a colder phase in the northern Pacific Ocean, and the Pacific Ocean is by far the largest ocean of all on Earth, and therefore the most important ocean. And this is kind of a significant situation here, that the northern Pacific Ocean flipped into a cold phase a few years ago, and that continues right now. So there are some researchers out there and some studies out there that suggest that the combination of colder phase and negative PDO, PDO is an index that NOAA has developed that kind of tracks sea surface temperatures in the Pacific Ocean. Now that we are in a negative PDO, that combined with what's going on in the sun could ultimately have an impact on global temperatures over the next several years or a couple of decades. So we'll continue to monitor the situation. Again, right now, the sun is in a rather calm state, despite the fact that it's headed towards a solar maximum sometime in the middle or latter part of 2013. That's it for now. For the SIweather.com, I'm the SI meteorologist, Paul Dorian.